Public Relations. Edward L. Bernays. 1945. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 1. The Growth of Public Relations. 5. American Public Relations from 1600 to 1800. Public opinion and public relations played an important part in American life from the very beginning. Many colonists, like the Puritans who settled New England, came to America seeking freedom of religious worship. But other colonists came to seek economic opportunities or adventure and were often persuaded to do so by the great land companies through various public relations devices. Many colonists brought with them that faith in a free press which the Puritan Revolution had promulgated. They brought with them, too, the newspaper and developed it along American lines. Opinion and opinion molding became burning issues in the 18th century as a result of clashes between the American colonies and the British authorities. While the authorities sought to control the press through censorship, taxation, and licensing, the colonies fought for its freedom. Newspapers and pamphlets were the chief media for reaching the public. As the conflict between the colonists and the mother country moved to a climax, American public relations experts developed many devices to win public support for independence. They used oratory, newspapers, meetings, committees, pamphlets, and correspondence to preach their cause. This movement culminated in the Revolutionary War. And when the United States was set up as an independent country, the Constitution, 1789, and the Bill of Rights, 1791, proclaimed freedom of speech, press, petition, and assembly as fundamental rights to which all Americans were entitled. By making freedom of opinion and discussion a basic American right, the First Amendment of the Constitution opened the way for a free press and for all forms of opinion molding. Before anyone can wish to affect opinion, opinion must count, and before opinion can count, it must be free to express itself. Thomas Jefferson made this clear when he wrote in 1787, "The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right, and were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers, and be capable of reading them." To go back for a moment to the preceding century, as early as 1620 the Virginia Company tried to attract settlers to the colonies by advertisements. It issued a broadside in England that promised anyone who would bring a colonist to America before 1625 a grant of 50 acres of land. In the Atlantic Migration, 1607 to 1860, A History of the Settlement of the United States, Marcus Lee Hansen points out that this broadside of the Virginia Company was only the first of many similar attempts, which indicate that the colonization companies used techniques of suggestion and persuasion. The Great Migration from Europe to colonial America depended over the years on the maintenance of effective relationships between various companies and the publics they depended upon. According to Fulmer Mood, propaganda was employed not only to attract settlers but also to attract capital investment to the colonies. Within the colonies themselves, there was little occasion for a while for cultivating public relations. The country was sparsely settled, communications were negligible, and the struggle for survival dominated the thought and action of the colonists. Yet from the start they were devoted to the principle of a free press. When William Penn sailed for Pennsylvania on the Welcome, he took a printer with him. The printer was assured he could print anything he liked for distribution to the people. And when, in 1681, Pennsylvania proclaimed freedom of opinion as a right, it was the first colony to do so. Thereafter colonial public opinion came more and more to demand a free press and a free land. According to Alfred McClung Lee in the Daily Newspaper in America, colonial printers were newspaper publishers. A printing press was brought to Cambridge, Massachusetts, as early as 1638. There it was operated in connection with Harvard College. It fed New England sermons, broadsides, poems, Puritan tracts, catechisms, and copies of books published in England. By 1715 the American colonies had 8 presses, 6 in New England, 1 in New York, and 1 in Philadelphia. The first American newspaper, the Boston News Letter, a small 4-page, 2-column weekly devoted to local and European items, was published in 1704. It was followed in 1719 by Andrew Bradford's American Weekly Mercury, and in 1721 by James Franklin's New England Courant. 22 new papers were started between 1713 and 1745. By 1765, every colony except New Jersey and Delaware had at least one newspaper. For the most part, colonial papers published poems, essays, and reprints of articles that had appeared in Britain. After 1750 the colonial press devoted more space to politics, sensational events, and letters from prominent people. In 1754, The first cartoon appeared Ben Franklin's picture of a snake divided into 8 parts, with the caption "Unite or Die." The earliest contributors to the American press combined the functions of reporters, editorial writers, and press agents. In the first half of the 18th century, Alfred McClung points out, colonial newspapers and magazines relied on 2 types of contributions: poetry and prose sent in by literary people and propaganda contributed by interested parties. Typical of the latter was material appearing in the New England Courant, which published propaganda on religious and political issues by members of the Hellfire Club. This club, Lee tells us, schooled the press agents of the Revolution. As the spirit of independence grew in the colonies, it came into conflict with British attempts to control the press in the interests of the mother country. As has been said, the British authorities controlled the colonial press by 2 methods: they licensed newspapers, and they censored news, editorials, and advertising. This made freedom of opinion an important issue for the colonists. In 1734-35, the issue was dramatized by the arrest and trial of John Peter Zenger, an American newspaper publisher. Zenger was imprisoned on a charge of libel because his newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal, which spoke for the colonists, had criticized British members of the government. At this trial he was defended by the famous Philadelphia lawyer Andrew Hamilton, who argued that Zenger could not be guilty of libel if his statements were proved true. The trial resulted in Zenger's acquittal. This verdict had great impact throughout the colonies. The Zenger story was told and retold for public relations purposes. It was used as a symbol in the fight of the American colonists for a free press of their own. Every time the British authorities threatened colonial freedom of expression, the American press promptly reprinted the Zenger story. The Zenger trial thus played an important role in achieving 2 results for the colonies. It helped to establish freedom of the press and to confirm the right of newspapers to record and discuss government decisions and actions, and it established that in libel cases juries must take into account not merely the published facts but the intent of publication. Subsequently, British authorities tried to control the colonial press by imposing a tax on each sheet printed. From 1755 on, American printers fought this newspaper tax in a public relations campaign that condemned it as a tax on knowledge. The Stamp Act of 1765 constituted another attempt on the part of the British authorities to control the press. This act taxed newspapers according to size, and it also taxed advertisements. Furthermore, it required each newspaper to carry the publisher's name, thereby making it possible for the authorities to lay their hands on critics of the government. Continuing their fight for a free press, colonial printers instigated crowds to seize the stamp paper issued under the act. They also suspended publication of their newspapers or published them without titles or disregarded the Stamp Act altogether. This agitation, headed by Samuel Adams of Boston, finally led to repeal of the Stamp Act. Adams has been called the great press agent of the American Revolution. In cooperation with his associates, he disseminated propaganda for American independence from 1748 to 1776, using newspapers, pamphlets, and other devices for pleading the cause of the colonies. Among the Boston newspapers Adams used for spreading the idea of independence were the Independent Advertiser and the Gazette. He developed techniques of persuading the public that foreshadowed the United States Committee on Public Information of World War I. He kept in touch with committees of correspondence which he set up in 8 towns, to each of which he sent copies of the Boston Gazette. To build up public opinion in favor of independence, he used his newspaper and his committees of correspondence to publicize the Boston Massacre of 1770 and the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Paul Revere, the great courier of the American Revolution, carried the news of the Boston Tea Party to various towns, reaching Philadelphia before Christmas. Vernon L. Parrington, in Main Currents in American Thought, says that Samuel Adams occupies a distinguished place in the history of the rise of political democracy. He was by no means the first American to espouse the democratic cause, but he was the first to conceive the party machinery to establish it in practice. The single purpose of his life was the organization of the rank and file to take over control of the political state. He was the instrument of a changing world that was to transfer sovereignty from the aristocratic minority to the democratic majority. Political sovereignty inheres potentially in the mass will of the people, but if that will is restrained from exercising its strength by an undemocratic psychology, it remains powerless in the presence of an organized minority. The America in which Samuel Adams labored was ripe to throw off the inhibitions of the popular will, and it was his perception of that fact, and the tenacity and skill with which he cajoled the mass to make a push for perfect political liberty, that made him an outstanding figure in our history. In his hands the majority will became in reality the sovereign will. But before he could wield it he must create it, and before he could create it he must understand the mass mind. He must turn popular prejudice to his own purpose. He must guide the popular resentment at grievances into the way of revolution. He must urge the slow-moving mass forward until it stood on the threshold of independence, beyond which lay the ultimate goal of his ambitions, the democratic state. And so, in pursuit of his life purpose, Samuel Adams became a master political strategist, the first of our great popular leaders. 1. Of the leading colonial press agent, Alfred McClung Lee has said in his History of the American Newspaper, Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, because he was a press agent who could dim the feats of many successors, is to press relations experts what Benjamin Harris and B. Franklin are to printers and newspapermen. Under tremendous handicaps he worked out methods similar to those in use today and might be regarded as the father of American press agentry. Another prominent colonial press agent was John Dickinson, who has been called the penman of the Revolution. He was the most popular writer of his day, and his arguments for the colonial position against British rule were the most numerous and the most timely. He was a statesman whose writing often grew out of practical activity. For example, as a member of the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, he drafted that body's Declaration of Rights and its petition to the King. He was also the author of the Articles of Confederation, passed by the Continental Congress in 1777. Among the most influential documents of independence that he wrote were the letters of a farmer in Pennsylvania, published serially in the Pennsylvania Chronicle in 1766 and 1767. In them he attacked the British Townshend Acts and the natural rights theory of politics, appealing to the common sense of the colonists through simple legal arguments that everyone could understand. Through the activities of the press agents of the Revolution, the letters were reprinted in 21 of the 25 papers published in the American colonies and went through numerous pamphlet editions. Arriving in 1774 from England, Thomas Paine joined the American independence movement and soon became one of its most effective spokesmen. He founded the Pennsylvania Magazine and edited it for a year and a half. His famous pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, thrilled the colonies with its arguments for separation from England and the establishment of an independent American republic. Common Sense was reprinted by the colonial newspapers and in addition achieved a circulation of 120,000 in pamphlet form. Washington said that it worked a powerful change in the minds of many men. The open movement for the colony's independence dates from the publication of Paine's masterpiece of Persuasion. During the Revolutionary War, Paine joined the army of General Greene as a volunteer aide-de-camp whose job it was to further the morale of the troops. When the conflict went against the colonists at first, he wrote a stirring tract called The Crisis. The opening line of that tract, "These are the times that try men's souls," became the slogan of the embattled Americans. Through such pamphlets, which played an important part in creating the spirit of 1776, and through the newspapers, as Alfred McClung Lee points out, Samuel Adams, Tom Paine, and others filled a place in the Revolution similar to that of editors, reporters, and newsgathering associations, as well as special propagandists, during subsequent conflicts. Oratory also was part of the strategy employed in the public relations of the American Revolution. Everyone is familiar with Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. But equally effective in molding colonial opinion were the Virginia Resolutions, which Henry wrote as a member of the House of Burgesses. The resolutions were adopted as a declaration of resistance to the Stamp Act and as an assertion that the colonies had the right to legislate for themselves independently of the British Parliament. The movement resulting in the Revolutionary War was given tremendous impetus by the wide circulation of the Virginia Resolutions by the press agents of the Revolution. They were first published in the Maryland Gazette, then reprinted in the Newport Mercury, which the British authorities promptly suppressed. But this type of censorship was unable to halt their spread. They were quickly reprinted by the Pennsylvania Gazette, the Boston Gazette, and many other colonial papers. The public relations techniques employed by the leaders of the American Revolution have been brilliantly described by Philip Davidson in Propaganda in the American Revolution. This study shows that the leaders recognized the importance of public relationships in creating a new society. They used newspapers, broadsides, tracts, pamphlets, speeches, songs, plays, meetings, and demonstrations to mold colonial opinion in the direction of independence. From a public relations point of view, the Boston Tea Party was an overt act staged to dramatize American resistance to British authority. The most famous and most effective document issued by the press agents of the American Revolution was the Declaration of Independence, a paean to freedom inspiring people the world over to this day. The author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, has himself explained the public relations aspects of this historic document. When forced, therefore, to resort to arms for redress, an appeal to the tribunal of the world was deemed proper for our justification. This was the object of the Declaration of Independence. Not to find out new principles or new arguments, never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but also to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. In these words Thomas Jefferson summed up not only the spirit that led to the establishment of the United States as an independent republic, but also that sense of public relationships which inhere in true public relations.